Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Scott Tomko from Healthcare Purchasing News. Today, we're going to discuss optimizing the critical clinical areas of your hospital with a focus on how supply chain leaders are looking to innovative technologies to optimize revenue-generating areas, such as elective surgery and specialty pharmacy. Today's session is being sponsored by VPL, a leading provider of cloud-based freight management and supply chain solutions specific to the healthcare industry. VPL empowers clinical supply chain and outpatient pharmacy leaders by giving them the data-focused and technology-enabled solutions they need to build smarter, more resilient workflows. The experts we'll be speaking to today include Mr. Derek Seif, Chief Strategy and Product Officer at VPL, and Ms. Maria Hames, an established corporate account consultant in today's healthcare industry. At VPL, Derek is focused on building the future of the healthcare and pharmacy supply chains. Maria specializes in simplifying complex sales processes at some of the largest healthcare organizations in the country. So to begin, I'm going to begin with the question, what does it mean to have a clinically integrated supply chain from a logistics standpoint?
So Scott, when I hear clinically integrated supply chain, to me, it means an enterprise or a system resource planning approach to supply chain management. It's going to be incorporating clinical input into what types of products and utilization are needed for patient outcomes, ultimately which supplies and suppliers are being used, and it also manages all of the distribution and logistics activities through a centralized, standardized system as opposed to using multiple processes within the organization. In essence, it's the ability to translate the clinical speak into supply chain speak. And I think COVID really put a spotlight on the importance of this process. A great example was finding reliable substitution products for when a primary product wasn't available. That clinical integrated process was key to determine and validate if a tier 2 or tier 3 or later tier substitution would require additional accessories, staff training, or allocations that would need to be considered to get the product to patient care. Also logistically, the ability to know when a product would be received, if shipping delays or OEM back orders were going to need to be communicated back to the clinical team so that patient procedures and care would not be impacted. So that's kind of how I think of it.
So we think about clinically integrated supply chains in two directions: products shipped inbound from suppliers into the hospital and products shipped outbound from the hospital to clinics, other hospitals, and more importantly, to patients' homes. So clinically integrated supply chains for us means focusing on logistics challenges on a per clinical area basis. And in today's environment, prioritizing those clinical areas that are revenue generating areas of the hospital. So let me zoom in a minute on how a clinically integrated supply chain for products coming into the hospital are so important. So the overarching goal of the supply chain is to ensure critical products get to the patient. So analyzing the logistics data by clinical area can help inform category management and value analysis initiatives that are ongoing in the hospital and coordinating between supply chain and clinical administration, as Maria had pointed out. So an example of some of the logistics metrics for these initiatives can be order lead times by supplier location. These can be early indicators of back order issues, and metrics around carrier on-time performance can have an impact on products that are needed for a real critical procedure. So by integrating all these inbound logistics and metrics for each clinical area allows the health system to make broader logistics decisions for each of their clinical areas in one central place.
Guys, which clinical areas have the biggest supply chain challenges that need to be solved and why?
So any clinical area that has the responsibility to get products to patient homes has the biggest challenges because of the lack of control once it leaves the hospital. So today, the most unique and pressing challenges are in the specialty pharmacy as they're delivering medications to patients. So these challenges are high stakes and need to balance logistics decisions, taking into account variables such as the value of the product, the temperature of the product, the time to deliver. And so our goal has really been to remove that decision-making process from the pharmacist and the technicians so that they can focus more on patient care. But doing this is really a delicate balance of logistics cost, as well as ensuring patients receive their medications, and on top of that, making sure that the health system gets reimbursed for those drugs. And for that reimbursement, so they can make sure that they can continue to serve more patients. So as the care at home trend continues, these logistics challenges that we have today in specialty pharmacy are only going to be exacerbated in other clinical areas.
You know, Derek, I think pharmacy is a great example. Another area I think that most providers would agree is the operating room. It's definitely the biggest consumer of supplies and therefore very challenging. And the OR is an area that generates huge amounts of revenue, but also requires high demand on the product availability and reliability. Those complexity of procedures, the demographics that vary from facility to facility, not just on the type of procedures being done, but the variation on how those procedures are being tackled by the OR staff, make the OR a big ticket on supply chain, both cost and time. OR would probably be followed by other procedural units like endoscopy, cath lab, and interventional radiology. So when you're looking at what's happened over the years where you've had a decline in some of those elective procedures, cost and consistency has become more important. So standardization is a key area, and providers are really focusing on reducing SKUs and cost. The clinical input in these areas are needed to help identify best practices and usable substitutes. A good example that I look at again is in that ortho spine space in OR. That's just one area of surgery, and it's not unlikely for a facility to have 30 plus different suppliers in the space at a facility. Trying to get to 15 is even a challenge for more systems, but they're trying to strive for a more predictive supply chain so that these complex critical care procedures can be done on time with best outcomes and with more predictive cost and supply availability.
Very good. As hospital care moves from acute into clinics, other remote hospitals, and to the home, what impact does it have on supply chain logistics? And what do health systems need to start thinking about to solve that question?
You know, most systems have not historically done well at managing supplies outside the four walls of the acute care facility due to the number of delivery points, that lower unit of measure, and the relatively lower acuity of supplies. Most of the enterprise systems have a decent view into some of their owned and managed centers, like their surgery centers and standalone ERs or large MOBs. And whether they're self-distributing or not, they're usually partnering with a non-acute distributor that is set up for that. But even with using a distributor partner, the cost is many times cost plus 15% or greater to get to these non-acute facilities. So systems are looking at ways to lock down that wish list catalog that they get from their non-acute distributor and standardize products across facilities and even across the system to manage SKUs and cost. Non-acute data systems are commonly not speaking the same language as the mothership. So you'll see disparate data systems from the acute care to the non-acute. So clean, usable data and processes to make decisions around supply chain are going to continue to be an area that needs improvement. What do you think, Derek?
Yeah, interesting. We're really paying close attention to this home healthcare trend. The study I just read said about in the supply chain is 16% of the total cost of a $90 billion home healthcare market. And that's a pretty significant dollar amount to your point about the cost plus. And that's really due to the complexity and fragmentation. There are multiple clinical workflows that are really complicate the issue due to that mix of products that are needed in order to get to serve those chronic disease states. We talked a little bit about specialty drugs, but they can also include the pre and post operative kits, the therapeutics, diagnostics, certainly the mobility assist equipment that have to get to the home and make it more complex. As far as guidance, though, I think proactive is always better, right? So the sooner that health systems should start thinking about different strategies and helping to manage these complexities, especially as it relates to logistics, they just have a better chance of making sure that they don't lose connection with that patient to avoid the readmission back into the hospital. The getting started obviously is the hardest part, but evaluating each clinical category and ensure that they have the ideal mix of logistics services is key, because sometimes it's carrier, sometimes it's courier. There has to be coordination amongst different clinical areas within the hospital, all to get to maybe one destination point. And being open to change over time and using data that can identify where certain logistics failures are happening or where successes are happening, to be willing and able to change at a moment's notice and mix up those different service levels for logistics.
Okay, what do we see as the healthcare market challenges that prevent this nirvana of visibility and resiliency for critical clinical supply chains?
So Scott, this is one of my favorite topics. There are a lot of consortiums and conferences that talk a lot about these problems and supply chain visibility and resiliency. In fact, I recently participated at a roundtable discussion at a visibility conference and asked the question to a table full of manufacturers, distributors, service providers, and the government, and said, how do you define visibility and resiliency problem? And the answers for each of those stakeholders was different, which brings me to challenge number one, problem definition. Each stakeholder defines the visibility and resiliency problem different. And so it feels like each stakeholder is trying to solve a different problem. The next two challenges are two challenges that Maria had hit upon a couple moments ago around data standardization and data privacy. So data standardization challenge is that data is required to share, that is required to share, is fragmented and often found in different systems, different ERPs, et cetera, and is not as accurate and consistent as it needs to be for actionable results. And then on the data privacy side, the sensitivity of the data for each stakeholder is a real thing, especially as it relates to the data that's directly related to competitive advantages, but it prevents data sharing agreements to be put in place. And so lots of focus needs to be put on that challenge as well as the other two.
You know, it's funny, Derek, when you mentioned that roundtable, and I think historically stakeholders in healthcare, from the manufacturer, supplier, to distributor, to the end user, to the actual utilization of the product, we haven't been great partners, and we certainly haven't been very transparent in the past. And a lot of that resiliency of our supply chain is dependent on that solid data, and we don't have standard nomenclature or codes for our product description. So data cleansing and standardization on UPC is something we've been talking about in trade shows and trying to solve as an industry for 20 years, and we still have not been able to normalize data. Other industries like auto, grocery, airlines have done it, and I'm hopeful that COVID will help us get us to being a little bit more transparent and collaborative before it's decided for us through regulation. I realize that healthcare is a different animal, and that making a mistake in supply chain can cost a life, and not just a canceled flight or a delay in a new car delivery, but we definitely need to improve. So completely agree.
So what needs to be true for the nirvana to happen?
You know what? Healthcare in general is more complex. The end product is patient safety and health. So there's always an exception, and it's difficult to standardize to a specific playbook. But something has to happen to get us closer to this nirvana, because we can't continue at the pace we're at. We simply can't afford it the way it exists today. One of my favorite statistics is that the US represents 4% of the worldwide population, but accounts for 40% of the global health community economy. So we need to find a better way to translate that into better outcomes and affordable care. From a supply chain perspective, that means a more predictive and resilient one. So we're more prepared for the next pandemic or the natural disaster. So making decisions again around that data that is usable is the key to the way that we get through to that data through collaboration, transparency, true partnerships leveraged by, much like Derek talks about, the technology that will help us do it more efficiently and accurately.
So the data is key. And my answer will really resonate with anyone with a scientific background, because I look at this from a scientific methodology standpoint. We want to take data, understand and agree on the problem to solve first with a couple of innovative stakeholders, whether they're the manufacturers, the government, the providers, et cetera, to really prove out a solution. And we want to focus on a problem where there's accurate and consistent data, where each of those stakeholders have 100% control over that data, so that and what that might mean is that we're solving the problem for a very specific product line or specific critical clinical area. And then leveraging technology on top of that needs to be true to be able to prove that once you can prove that out, it can now scale to more vendors and health systems. And the last thing that I will say that needs to be true is that we always need to make sure that when we're developing solutions, that we keep the patient in mind, because the patient is the most important.
Definitely patient-centered.
Well, thank you, Derek and Maria. That was an invaluably informative presentation. On behalf of HPN and VPL, I would like to thank everyone who logged on to watch. Be sure to watch the other sessions in our forum, and please click the link at the top of your screen to return to the event hub.